Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the zero-noise application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Invicti, AppSec with zero noise. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Struggling to secure all your applications with modern identity services? You're not alone. But with identity orchestration, you can say goodbye to refactoring and complexity. Strata Identity helps you modernize app identity at scale while mitigating security risks and simplifying policy management. Maintain a consistent security posture and simplify policy management with identity orchestration. If you're ready to simplify your identity environment and improve your app security, share your IAM challenge with the Strata team to get a brand new set of earbuds. Just visit securityweekly.com/strata to learn more. That's securityweekly.com/strata. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Jeff Moss about DEF CON, lawyers, policy, and the importance of advocating for how technology impacts civil society. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, one announcement. As a member of the Security Weekly community, we are proud and pleased to stumble over words because we're offering you a whole 20%. That's what struck me. 20% is pretty good off of InfoSec World 2023 tickets. Join a community of over 2,000 security professionals and innovators at InfoSec World on September 25th through 27th at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort. Experience world-class learning and networking through enlightened keynotes, informative panel discussions, interactive breakout sessions, hands-on workshops, and more. Register today at securityweekly.com/InfoWorld2023 using code ISW23-SecWeek20. And Mr. Kinsella, we're still flying at 10,000 feet. We can't quite land the show yet, but we do need to look at some news. And I want to start off with AI and ChatGPT things. And honestly, because I was struggling to find some news that was interesting and different and not just repeating prompt injection and yet more prompt injection. Because it's interesting and fun, but it's starting to feel a little bit like the cross-site scripting of AI, which is kind of a neat thing to play with, but maybe it's not the most impactful thing we should be talking about. So in that, I found a guide from Team 8 talking about generative AI and ChatGPT enterprise risks that I thought was pretty interesting. For at least it pulls out some aspects of talking about trusting third-party security. It does talk about legal and regulatory risks, talking about data leak risks. So it does maybe go a little bit outside of the normal purview of AppSec, but it touches on policy. And I think that I wanted to throw that in as a tie to our talk with Jeff. But I think you also were more successful, perhaps, in finding something new and different and interesting on the ChatGPT side.
We had a few. I do want to cover this one briefly because I think it's sort of interesting. And it's interesting for a few different reasons. One, if I can find that tab wherever it is in here, the folks behind it. I mean, I was going down through the author's page. I'm like, oh, I know him. I know him. Oh, I haven't seen him for a while. So they got a bunch of big, well-known folks in here. And as I started thinking through, even as you're just sort of doing the intro on, it's like, okay, well, the thought of my head was, is it too early to be writing a paper like this? Like this is like a, it's a, how many pages? 30-page white paper for CISOs about generative AI. That's okay. We're really early in this stage. It's good to have something to refer to, but at the same time, is it, have the thoughts solidified enough for us to be able to write this? And that's not a good or bad thing, but it's just a thought experiment. I'm like, okay, where's it from? Team 8, ain't never heard of them. Let's go and look and see what Team 8 is. No, nothing against Team 8. I just, I can't keep track of everybody. Team 8 is a venture capital fund. Okay, I think you have to start asking yourself, why would a VC be writing a white paper, 30-page white paper about GPT? And this is sort of one of my other hats comes on, right? Sort of the advising and investing side, startup world. And so while this has got a bunch of good people in it, got great stuff going on, this is written for two audiences. A, it's written for startups that they're hoping will, they want to show to startups, hey, we know about GPT, we can help you guys. You know, AI, everyone's trying to get into the space. But it's also for the people who invest in this, in the VCs, to be able to go, hey, look, we're at the center of, we've written this paper by all these people. So the backroom stuff on something like this is sort of interesting to me. But I will pivot and go talk about the other GPT thing, which this I had found a week or two ago. So, you know, it's GDB. We talk about GDB a good bit on here, but quick disclosure, I don't use GBD very often directly. I'm actually checking myself that I'm not making another slip on my lip, GDB. I'm a bit of a pointy clicky guy, especially when it comes to debugging. So I much prefer to be using VS Code or Visual Studio or some sort of, you know, environment like that where I'm able to actually easily monitor multiple variables or stacks, whatever I want on the screen, and click my way through a debugging process. So while I can use and I'm familiar with GDB and it's been around forever, obviously, I'd much prefer to be visual. But okay, there's Chat GDB out now. So okay, well, would this help? This is our tool of the week or my tool of the week. And it's interesting, right? So at least from what I've seen of it so far and when I've played with it, it's more about educating and helping you understand what commands are in GDB than it is about sort of, okay, we've done this stack, we've printed this stack, what does it mean? So it's more about helping you use GDB itself versus the debugging process. So it might be interesting to some folks as you're learning this tool or want to get in there. But yeah, that's what it's able to find from both a tool and an AI point of view.
Yeah, and I think hopefully GDB will be more helpful than just saying, well, maybe you should just printf this variable and see what, and debug that way.
It's
so,
very,
but yes,
it's very close for me, to be honest. So like, I'd rather printf a few variables before actually getting myself in the mood to go and use GDB. And at some point it breaks, right? And I'm sure that differs for all of us, but yeah.
Yeah, there's only so much where it's like I have a tolerance for going and poking at registers and checking to see what frame pointers and function pointers are at the moment. But there is a time and place. But it's great to see that these can be helpful to the end user. So listeners, do let us know how these tools have been helping you, and what kind of tools or aspects we should be paying attention to, because some of the other things I've been paying attention to. So let's shift from .vcs and the VC world into Microsoft world, another huge world of money and craziness. And this was, again, maybe not completely AppSec related, but I had to talk about, because everyone else will be, Microsoft shifts to new threat actor naming taxonomy, and they're bringing everything in the weather. And this is more just fun of, you know, naming things is, you know, traditionally one of the hardest problems in development, and this is where everyone's going to start talking about how the naming goes. I don't know that I have a particularly interesting take on this, other than to say I wish they had gone a D&D route and they were naming these after monsters like the Catoblepus and the Illithid and the Bullywug, because those are fun words too. And there's also the Unearthed Arcana Appendix T, for all of you first edition players out there and know what I'm talking about the halberds and your Becta Corbins. But there's probably maybe one or two other actual aspects here we could talk about InfoSec, but let me see. Let's let John talk for a moment.
I'm just going to pivot and go in a completely different direction. And where I'm actually going to take it, you know, I'll have a segue here. So our friends over at Wiz have decided to stop poking around Microsoft and Azure and all the vulnerabilities which they have internally, which they don't name, and actually went and looked at a different cloud provider for a change. So this is a fun article that we both found where Wiz is now doing a little bit of research on Alley Cloud. I think this is actually really interesting. So one they found, so we've seen this in Azure, we've seen it in AWS, and now they just started looking at the database services at I refer to as Alley Cloud, but Alibaba Cloud. And they found, you know, so the naming folks are strong over here too. They're calling it what? BrokenSesame. Cute. But they found two vulnerabilities in here, a privilege escalation and an RCE. Okay, cool. They published that. They have the disclosure and the write-up and all that. That's really great. The part which was sort of interesting to me, and let's bring it back and tie the GPT thing in to a degree as well. There was an article last week or two out there. It wasn't security, so we're not talking about it here, but they were talking about with GPT, it's now becoming so expensive to train that And I believe Altman over at OpenAI is saying they're going to stop doing the current model, the current style of training these things because it's so big and so complex. I think they're closing in on $100 million to do a training session on GPT-4. Yeah. But the point here between these two, the point of that article was in this next generation or so, by the time they get to GPT-5, if organizations haven't been training or building those large-scale models and have this experience, they think they might not be able to catch up. It's that sort of like the scale you're talking about is so big and everything is so large and the experience needed that to actually catch up and stay relevant, it's going to be pretty difficult. I mean, I'm not saying everyone needs to have it. You don't always have to have that huge, crazy LLM, but if you're going down that path, it's going to get difficult. And bringing that back to this, with these cloud providers and the experience that these organizations have to build these systems securely and manage them securely and harden them, I'm sort of wondering, is there a point now where the big 3 or 4 providers are getting so experienced in securing and running these services, will a little, and I'm not talking about Ally Cloud, I know they're big in China, but will a smaller cloud be able to keep up, or are they going to have inherently more vulnerabilities? I think that's sort of interesting to think about. I hope it's not the case, right? I want there to be plenty of folks in there, but that's why I got to start thinking about this article. And then I can't remember if we've talked about this before, Mike, if you saw in this article, but they just happened to link over to the Peach framework. Did we talk about this?
We mentioned Peach, briefly. Yes, another fun acronym.
So again, for folks, I think the website might have been built out since the last time I looked at it personally, but it's a framework for how do you go about, either as a cloud provider or someone using a cloud provider, how do you go about using these services, hardening them, thinking about tenant isolation? Because one of the core problems with the vulnerability here, to sort of back up a sec, is, I think it's in the second or third, it's like one of the first things they talk about is multi-tenancy in Kubernetes. I'm like, oh, here we go, right? So, I mean, that's sort of a tease of how they were able to get in and break this thing in the first place. But then Pete sort of walks through, like, how do you do this? How do you harden it? How do you, sort of in a 2 maturity level setup, how do you do tenant isolation? So a refresher, a reminder for myself and anyone else who forgot about Peach as well.
Indeed. And there is, it's also a great segue into the Kubernetes security audit that NCC Group posted, shared publicly. And again, so they were pointing out, I grabbed this article, it's 54 pages. So we have some long articles to read through this week. But in this case, I highlighted because even if you're not interested in the specifics of Kubernetes, reading these types of security audit reports can be educational in terms of what are groups like NCC Group looking at. It doesn't necessarily give the helpful insights on their fuzzing techniques, their tools, and their how they approach doing these tests, nor do we get necessarily good feedback on what did they try that failed, meaning these are indicators of a good Kubernetes design, good secure architecture that can also be helpful for learning from, if we talk about also last week's CISA's like secure by design, secure by default points. But, this was, I think, a success for Kubernetes, that the NCC Group found a couple medium, several low, maybe a few informational types of issues within these systems, within the code, but nothing earth-shattering, nothing terrible. And I think one other thing that I'll mention real quick is, this was a Golang environment, and there are still issues here. So I'm going to beat the drum, and hopefully I haven't exhausted this phrasing so much yet, but it's, you can still be memory safe, but still have plenty of other types of vulnerabilities. And that's just kind of the subtext that I've made context here talking about this. But I don't think this means that you're going to stop running your own Kubernetes cluster just because of the security audit, John. So hopefully it hasn't scared you off.
I haven't run Kubernetes in, God, I think it's at least 2 years. So in disclosure, I was part of the team, which was, I didn't do the pen test, but actually sort of organizing this and getting this ready and sending it out to bid and finding the best vendor for this. So it's been an interesting ride. As I said, I haven't been doing too much Kubernetes recently, so I haven't been really active in the kube scene. But for folks to get a sense of how this goes, I mean, I think I've mentioned on the podcast here even that I was slightly involved in that like a year ago. these things are long processes. I mean, it's a big system, right? Don't get me wrong. But part of the reason also we've seen we talked about container defuzzing. There was another fuzzing one that we didn't get in here as well. And now the Kubernetes things. The reason these are all coming out at once is because KubeCon was last week. So, everyone's like, rush, rush, rush. How can we get stuff? What can we talk about? And this came out. And yeah, it looks really clean. I have not read through all 54 pages. I looked over the summary. I saw there was nothing critical. I'm like, cool. And that was it from my point of view. And again, I'm not really active in that side nowadays. But yeah, and,
one other thing I wanted to, okay.
Well, just really briefly on sort of what you're saying about the memory safety and stuff. They're almost, the flaws I saw were more, they're related to design and architecture and how you've put this big massive system together. And that comes to creativity of a pen test team to figure out how did these pieces work together, and how can you sort of manipulate that or find vulnerabilities in there.
Yeah, and in the report I wanted to highlight too, they say they took 9 people, 97 person days was the investment in this, which is pretty significant for a code audit. And that's also, I think, gives you a sense of what the OpenSSF is doing, why they're investing multi-million dollars in security audits of a lot of their open source environment, and why OWASP is going through a bit of its own identity crisis or its investment crisis of what do they also repeat this type of investment for other open source areas? Do they put investment in community, something else like that? Because it's just, I wanted to mention that as an area that we'll continue to track, continue to find interesting, or when it is interesting, we'll chat about it. Yeah. Some other things that might be interesting are GhostToken.
Well, let me go back to this one. This was two seconds more.
Yeah, sorry.
Because you just brought something. I was talking about the ability for people to catch up either GPT or in cloud security and stuff like that. On this, I mean, as you just said, so I might have seen numbers. I don't think I saw any numbers pricing wise. But this isn't cheap. This NCC, this top tier company. 100 man days. I mean, I'll let folks just sort of dream and think about what that number is, but it's quite in the 6 digits. And that wasn't free, right? NCC has done a lot of work with Cube and with open source, and they're respected and we talk about them a lot. But at the same time, someone got to pay for that. And if you're not a large foundation like both Kubernetes as well as the Linux Foundation, smaller open source projects are obviously they're smaller, so they're easier to test. But like, there's not too many folks out there that can actually afford testing like this to ensure top quality code. So how do we level that playing field? Also, is something to sort of think about. And again, it's a bit of a network effect in a way, right? Because as these projects come to Linux Foundation and gets more popularity, they're more of the funding and more of the developers are going there too. So how do the other orgs try to, I don't want to say keep up, but how do they ensure that they have some level of this going on as well? But I interrupted you, my apologies.
No, well, I think you set up a different and better segue now. So maybe talking about network effects and environments. You've got actually 2 articles about GitHub, but one about package provenance for NPM. Again, an area notorious for at least typo squatting, let alone other issues.
Yeah, so this is, I think it was 3 or 4 episodes back, we talked about Socket doing basically blacklists, a custom version of NPM, which would filter out packages that were known to be malicious. And now GitHub has come out with, if I find my tab here, not that tab, but this one, introducing NPM package provenance. So TLDR on this is they're allowing publishers to sign their packages, and then that goes into metadata, which is uploaded along with the package itself. Okay, cool. It's nice to see them do that step. I'm not trying to downplay in any way, but one of the thoughts in my head is, will users use this? I think that's what we're going to have to see over the next 6 months or so. I keep talking about 6 months, but here we are, 6 months later. But yeah, right. So it's like, okay, I don't think it's enabled by default. So I think you're still going to have to go and check and see, is the provenance of the package I installed or that I think I installed legitimate? I think it's going to be interesting to see how this gets used. But they're putting the tools out there, and I get why they're doing it this way, not the other way, right? Because it's you're putting the, I don't want to say onus, but the work happens by the publisher. GitHub doesn't have to manage a blacklist, which is obviously work, right? That especially on that scale. I'm still sort of torn between which I like better, which approach, but I think we'll have to sort of see how they get used in the field, so to speak.
Yeah, I think we'll have to do maybe we'll come up with a different time frame than 6 months, but this also mentioned too, and the Salsa 1.0. Yes. Was officially released this week, which I didn't really grab because I wasn't sure there was something too interesting or impactful other than saying it's at 1.0. But I think supporting your point, we still see continuing push forward of activity and action on in this area. So it does at least feel that Provenance, Salsa has a push because of some big behemoth like Google behind it. And that possibly will help just get the ecosystem to adopt. But it will be important to see because we also want to see things like, for example, CodeQL has been benefiting, and GitHub is showing off a bit of how it has benefited the ecosystem with their Wall of Fame.
Yeah, I think this was, it's interesting. We've talked about CodeQL in here a few times, right? Probably many times. But still, it's like, okay, well, when I saw this article, I'm like, okay, well, there's collections of rules out there, but how is it actually making a difference? So what they've sort of done is they've put together a list of vulnerabilities which have been found in open source projects because of CodeQL. So I thought that was pretty neat. The one thing I wish they had in here, which at least I haven't seen yet from clicking around, is I wish on each of these articles they actually showed the CodeQL which found the problem. I think that'd be really cool. Well, there's like references to it, but I don't see the actual rules, which I think that'd be really neat to go, tie those two pieces together. But still, this is sort of, it's proving that it's not just being used in private corps, but it's making a big difference in the world. So kudos on that one.
Indeed, and I wish I'd done a little bit more research because Mozilla has their JS Fun Fuzz, their fuzzer that is ancient for their JavaScript engine, and they have one of their Bugzilla items tied to JS Fun Fuzz has something like 1,000 entries, so they keep track of what that automated fuzzer finds. And Chrome has a similar thing with their fuzzing. They've got one super security bug that they can show off. Essentially their equivalent Wall of Fame of what fuzzing has found. So yeah, I agree. It's just really neat to see this highlighted because we want that reinforcement. Not GitHub, of course, maybe there's a little bit of marketing in here. So they want that the VCs to come and continue to give them money or something like that. But there's also, it is good to see that these tools are useful and, as you said, share the rules. So speaking of sharing, I'm trying to use that as a segue into something else. Maybe I'll go back to the GhostToken. So this was kind of interesting to me in the sense of OAuth and account security. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is adopting MFA, having FIDO keys, having strong authentication, so on and so forth, because a password is, valid credentials are a great backdoor into an account. There's also, if your account is compromised, you have to go through and essentially revoke or refresh all of your OAuth grants, because those are good ways to also either do maybe some lower privilege activities in your account, post to LinkedIn, post to something like that, or it just is a login as essentially effective. What this is showing is that it was possible by some researchers found that you could do, it's not quite a talk to race condition, but a sort of an order of operations, muck about with a client ID and display text as you're working with a API to get a grant onto a Google account that becomes invisible and irrevocable from the user. So it's one of those great things that our IR friends or our PCERT friends on our product security incident response teams have to go and look now at post-compromise and make sure that these aren't lurking about or weren't lurking about within systems. Google, of course, has now gone and fixed it.
Yeah, I thought this was the one thing I didn't get a chance to dig a little bit deeper. What I want to see is this purely from the web UI, or if I'm running the CLIs, I think I would still be able to see it. Or that was my understanding so far. But still, it's I think one of the bigger things around these type of tokens for people to think about is probably might be another way to search for it is can you time base those, or can you have expirations on them? And you know, I probably just triggered a good portion of our audience, because if you what you'll see is, well, we like to talk about as an industry putting TTLs on these type of things, like your GPG keys and things like that. When you actually do that in practice, it tends to sort of it raises hackles, right? If like everyone, I remember when I used to do GPG a lot for my code review days, and like every year I'd expire my key, and like all my customers would be like, "Do I have to go through this again with you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's sort of the thing." But at the same time here, if you're able to do something like that, and you're able to search for, hey, is there any keys which don't have an expiration on them, or the expiration is longer than I think or should be, you might be able to catch stuff like this that way as well. I can't remember if you can expire app keys, so I could be wrong in this particular case, but that's sort of the...
Yeah, in this case, they actually... They do call out that even with their attack loop, this particular token, like having a refresh token, lasts for 6 months, apparently. So, you know, this isn't permanent access, but 6 months is pretty semi-permanent enough for this. Yeah. And I think to your point, I was joking in the intro that we've fortunately gotten away from the 90-day password rotations, which weren't helping anybody and making people crazy. And speaking of 6 months from now, I don't know if it is 6 months, but I've been following OAuth 3.0, or maybe it's OAuth 2.1, just developments in that area to see if there's something new and cool within the spec to talk about, but don't have anything yet. I do want to take us back into the world of GDB, or at least back into the world of C and C++ for a moment, because here was a fun article that we got from Trail of Bits. And I always love reading their blog. They've gone everything from, we highlighted some of their AI research a while back, and we've highlighted the other thing about the Acropolis, which was another wonderfully named, speaking of naming themes. In this case, was pointing out typos in macros, typos in source code that basically disable or don't trigger the desirable compiler security flags that we might like to see. Now, it is very C and C++ specific. So and when I do that, I always want to make sure that we try to, that we can generalize these to our friends who are writing Python or Golang or Rust, you know. And I don't think any of them are dealing with the fortify source macro. But there are typos out there, and the summary sentence near the end of this is that I'll just read is that, you know, in an ideal world, a compiler, or let me editorialize that to your development tool chain, will automatically include information about all necessary security mitigations and hardening options in the generated binary. So it does speak to, do we really need to have this macro that's defining fortify source equals 1 equals 2, or even optimization levels can mess things up. If you're using a different optimization level for your acceptance testing, QA testing, than you are for production, because optimizations can have some surprising nuanced changes in your code, whether it is dealing with security issues for memory, or it's just dealing like hiding race conditions, hiding time of check, time of use issues, because the timing gets slightly off. And that's also one more point. That's why printf debugging can actually defeat you, because printf debugging might start to sync certain threads and surprise you that they're not working in the ways that you need to, they need to be going. And my filibuster's almost over, John, and that's why you'd have to go into GDB. All right, I got my C out for the month. I'm done.
Phew, we got over that. No, you know, you're reminding me with the printf thing. You haven't really lived until you start trying to do that printf stunt on like a multi-thread application. You know, you're talking about the thing, but yeah, no. At some point you got to use the tools. And actually, that brings back to me on this one. My thought was like, you want to use the tool to actually make sure that your resulting binary is doing all these things, right? So like, okay, for our, you know, we've got some pretty sharp listeners, but at the same time, for either the less sharp ones, or those who don't want to be doing this every day, or for the management, or, you know, the less sharp management, what, you get my point, hopefully. How many people can I offend at once? So, excuse me. The point though being like, okay, you think you put all this work into this, you think your team's doing the right thing, or you're using the right flags, or, you know, fortify source, but is that resulting binary, does that have these things or not? So I think that's sort of the biggest takeaway for me on this article is, how do you know that? one of the things I really liked about it here is one of the subtitles they have in here is typing is hard, but they've purposely misspelled it. But it's a great example because like just looking at it, you're like, you'll see it, but at the same time, it's like, that's such a small thing and that's just English, right? It's not like, some of these persnickety C things, which we keep talking about. So, yeah, it's kudos to these guys. I don't know how they are constantly able to put out stuff of this quality. It takes a lot of work. I mean, it's not just, we're talking about trilobits, but like, we're frequently talking about Wiz and a few other orgs as well. It's like, this takes a lot of work to do this type of stuff at this level. So thank you. But yeah, I think if you're working with, well, I was going to say C or C++, but it also comes back to you're saying Python or these other things we talk about, pretty much any software development, including things coming from GPT. How do you know that resulting thing is what you want it to be? Or is there some sort of hidden OAuth like, Google Cloud token in there that someone can use? And I think that's sort of the what we're hoping to help folks with at the end of the day. And like sometimes we'll offer that from a point of view of, hey, don't forget to think about this. But then also we try to bring in some of the tools to think through, hey, this will catch that, or it hasn't been signed, or you haven't, put the signature into NPM, or blah, 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 blah. Anyways, my filibuster.
No, blah, 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 blah. But those are, no, the blah, blah, blahs, that's the great thing that linters and tools should be able to identify. Let's take the mental burden off of the humans, and just because we can easily, autocorrect in our eyes as we're reading like two thes in the row, or as you're pointing out the typos, we'll skip over what that is, but the linters will happily complain and tell us that our human brains are poor. But our human brains can do some good things every once in a while, like building well-architected frameworks. So AWS updated their guidance on this, and that got your interest, John.
Yeah, so I caught this, I only caught it last week, I guess it came out a few weeks ago. So for a recap, I'm sure we talked about before, AWS has this thing called well-architected framework. And it started off with, you can probably see history back to like think of Sun and their blueprints, and there's some other orgs that have done this type of thing over the years. You've built this complex thing. And it's not quite a hardening guide. You can probably sort of say it is a hardening guide in a way. I don't want to think of it that way, but so they've now grown this to a point where it's got 6 quote unquote pillars. And while I was saying in my intro this in our show notes that they didn't really announce any security changes in this per se, so it's not like a direct hit for me. One of those 6 pillars is security. So for folks who are using Amazon or probably any cloud provider, or you want to sort of bone up on this type of stuff, it's definitely worth your time. They've now got a free tool that'll actually, in some cases, scan through your infrastructure and say, hey, you're not doing this X in a way which we consider well-architected. But also there's lots of demos and labs. And one of the things I found with this type of stuff, I know I mentioned recently, I'm working on my Solution Architect Pro cert with AWS. A lot of these things, like, I've used a cloud for going on 10 years now, but I haven't used all of cloud. Right, I know EC2 really well. I know the Lambdas and the containers obviously pretty well, quite well. But like if it comes to like Macy or some of their data architecture, data analytics or things like that, I've never got a chance to touch them. So either from the cert program with the labs there, or for something like this well architected, it walks you through being able to go and spin some of those type of things up, usually in their free tier, and actually get a sense for what those things are, how they work, and get your hands dirty with them. And then from our point of view, how do you secure those? So I think that's you can spend a lot of time on this. So for folks that are learning to learn that stuff more, or want to sort of see if they know what they think they know, it's a good chance to go and go work with that.
It is. And if we didn't quiz you on how Microsoft is naming their threat actor groups, but I think it's no less complicated for how AWS names its various services, starting with Macy and so on. I think that's a great way to take us out, John. Want to make sure we give you last chance. Any parting words, any final thoughts that you want to, or calls to action for our listeners?
Get your hands dirty. Don't just listen to us, but follow our show notes and go and work on things.
I think that's great. Indeed. Check out the show notes because we'll have a bunch of links to some of Jeff's work as well and DEF CON. And John always, he sometimes sneaks some good snark into his write-up. So if you haven't been reading the show notes, you've been missing out. And I do want to thank John for that. I want to thank everyone for listening to us. Please do subscribe and hit that like button. Check out the show notes. And speaking of cats in the background for our video watching friends, check out New Religion by Cat Temper. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.